make him super jealous because he hates the hack squat that he has in Salt Lake because it's really small. Like he's essentially topped it out and it's just like really tiny. And he's got to try to wedge it up to get more of an angle and more of an incline to get more load. Yeah. And then the one that we have at the Armor here in Knoxville is huge. It is absolutely enormous. It's fantastic. The only thing they fucked up on it is the band pegs. They have a slot to put band pegs, but you've got to be 6'10" to potentially get any band tension at any point in time in the lift. Because I'm in there and the band's already slack. And it's like, well, if I double loop it, maybe. But then that's a fuck off amount of band tension. Anyway.
Then you got to do double tension. I feel like Lexner would move across the country for a hack squat. And nothing else. Like that would be enough motivation for him to move. Which I respect.
Without question. I think that's totally true.
A great deal.
Yeah, once he gets crypto rich, dude, I'm like, he's just going to move on. He's going to move on to the farm. He's going to buy any machines that we don't have in the barn gym at that moment. And we'll never see or hear from him again.
Yeah. Sounds like a good life.
Excellent, guys. Well, I'm excited for this one. I think this will be fun. So we got Ryan LaCure and then Ethan Grossman on board today to talk hypertrophy and making muscles bigger, because I think that's a very fascinating and fun topic. Everyone listening to this, I think, would like to put on more muscle at some point in time. So everyone, I think, essentially knows who you are, Ryan, because you've been on so many of these now. But Ethan, if you could give us the quick 30-second elevator pitch, just who you are, what you do, the quick background story.
Cool. Thanks, James. As always, appreciate having me on. And Ryan and I do these, on Sundays here and there anyway. So it's just kind of like a normal weekend. So quick elevator pitch. I mean, I'm a trainer in New York City. I work at a gym called Hype. Mainly train Gen Pop people right now. And I work with a guy named Pat Davidson. I'm assuming he's been on this podcast as well. So he's my business partner. We have a fitness software company called Strength Score that we've been working on for the past few years. So that takes up part of my time. In-person, one-on-one personal training takes up a part of my time, and then bodybuilding takes up the rest of it. Got there, basically worked at a few gyms prior to Hype in New York City, came to New York City to work at a place called Peak Performance. Met a bunch of great people there, including Doug Petizian and the whole Resilient Performance crew there. He's still my physical therapist. And before that, went to Springfield College. Pat was my professor there. And for the last 10 years, we've been kind of just traveling spot to spot with each other, doing the whole personal training gig, doing the whole software gig. And in the meantime, just working towards getting my pro card, and finally did that about 8 weeks ago now at the Amateur Olympia. So here we are.
Yeah, man. Congratulations again on that, by the way. I know that's been that's a multi-year. For people that listening don't really appreciate or understand the sport. Like that is a multi-year project. That's not something that you're just 12 months and I'm just gonna walk on stage and make this thing happen.
Nowadays, it kind of is in the other classes, because you have the women's bikini and the men's bikini basically. And there's 4 or 5 other classes that didn't exist when Ryan and I first got into the sport. Originally it was just, men's bodybuilding, women's figure, and there's also women's bodybuilding, which is a little bit of a fringe sport, because you're, in that case, taking male hormones. There's a little bit of almost on the side of gender transformation going on there. So that sport's kind of been in and out of the scene, over the last maybe 10 years or so. But essentially the 2 big ones were men's bodybuilding, women's figure. Now you have women's physique, you have wellness, you have bikini, you have men's physique, you have men's classic physique, bodybuilding. So basically you're able to get more fans in the seats because there's more friends and family coming. And they say from a marketing standpoint, it's more attainable, and people are more interested in looking like those athletes, so it's more marketable. But to the attainable aspect of it, to be a bikini or to be a physique competitor, not to take anything away from those guys or girls, because, they still work very, very hard. It just, to diet down to that level of leanness is never easy. But the amount of muscle mass that you have to put on is significantly less. So it's not uncommon to take someone with a really good shape, and that just looks the part. You add a little bit of muscle, diet down. It's a much quicker process. So I've noticed, just like going, to some bodybuilding gyms recently, because I mainly train, over at Hype. But when I venture out, into, more of the like hardcore old school bodybuilding gyms, you meet people now that are like, yeah, I've been training for a year and I'm trying to get my pro card. Where I think for like Ryan and I, it was much more of like, oh, this is a decades long process. Like this might never happen. We're just going to kind of like take the first step forward, see what kind of progress, we get in the first year or two, maybe step on stage, test the waters, and then just like literally one step at a time, kind of work your way up through the ranks. Whereas people now are in their first year of training and they're like, oh, I want to get my pro card. It's kind of like, well, what's the point? Like there's nothing at the end of that rainbow. Like literally there's just more suffering. Like it's just more discomfort. There's, there's no pot of gold. There's no money. There's no like fame, there's really nothing to be had. And it's interesting nowadays how people kind of like seek the title or, just want to put it as like letters after their name, when really like the entire journey is just one of like, self-mastery, self-discovery, and just kind of, using it as a way to build yourself as a person. Whereas I think a lot of times nowadays people are looking at it as an endpoint, much like, with social media, it's, we're looking at it as an endpoint to fame rather than just a way to, to display what you've built as a human and who you are. And I think the people that are doing it well, like yourself, I mean, they're just taking something that's a passion or a hobby, and, they've spent years developing themselves, years developing like their skill set and their value. And then they're just presenting that value, where a lot of people now are saying like, I see what James is doing and I want to be James. Like, how do I market myself? How do I create a brand? And it's like, well, the brand kind of creates itself, when you have value. So I think, for people like yourself and Ryan, like you've built value over the years and people, are interested in what you have to offer. So it's not like, the marketing and the branding and all that stuff, comes secondary, where a lot of times now it's, the first thing.
Yeah. So I think an actually really good place to start this. A lot of nuggets there, by the way. But I think,
we could just end the podcast right there. I feel like that might be enough for
we're
people
done
to
and
think
cut.
About. Yeah.
No, I think to put this in perspective, because I think the one key thing there you mentioned is the amount of muscle that has had to be put on over time for you to be able to get the pro card you got 8 weeks ago. Let's actually put in perspective the difference in body weight that we're talking. How much did you weigh when you graduated college versus how much did you weigh pre-cut for the show, and then how much did you weigh when you actually stepped on stage? Just so we have an actual, I think, physical number of like how much mass needed to get put on to reach this point.
I don't know exactly, like going way back, I don't know exactly when I first started lifting. Like I can remember the first time I like stepped foot into the weight room, like the strength conditioning room at my high school, start working out for football. Sort of remember that being a relatively like intimidating scene, because it was like varsity, football team. I was in 7th grade. People are just like deadlifting and slamming weights, and there's like heavy metal playing. It wasn't a situation where I walked in and was instantly like, this is amazing. Like, this is who I want to be. It was like definitely a little bit of like an intimidating environment. And that's kind of like my first memory of being exposed to training. But, I had some friends reach out to me, from like high school and even grade school after the show, and just like recounting some things, in our past that maybe led up to this. And, I had a buddy reach out from grade school actually, and we were just talking about lifting weights in my basement, when we were, we must have been 4th, 5th grade. And, the weights are still down there. So this, obviously is true, but like, we had the cement weights with like the plastic over the top, and like the really narrow bench press that you like pinched, between your thumb and index finger. So you just like, every time you put it back, you just end up bleeding like next to your thumb. And, the weights are really wide and the bar was really narrow, so it only fit so many weights. So what we would do is we'd hang paint cans off the side of the barbell, like to add load. And of course it was like very uneven and everything. But I remember that was probably like my first exposure to lifting, like sometime in grade school, just like playing around in the basement with stuff that we had down there. And then later on, once I got some jobs as a teenager, I eventually built out like my own little weight room in the basement and painted it and hung posters up, put a little like heater down there for the winter. It was cool. And I would say, around that time, like I probably started lifting weights for football, like 7th or 8th grade to start getting ready for like freshman football. And I would say at that time I was probably like, I can remember being 180 pounds on the scale. Like and I was lifting at the time because I didn't really start weighing myself until I was actually like a ways into lifting. So I don't know if I started lifting at like 150, 160, but I remember being like a reasonably lean, muscular, like 185. And that was probably like, 8th, 9th grade, somewhere in there. And then by the time I graduated high school, I was, in the 200s. So I don't know, somewhere between 200, 215. And kind of same thing college-wise. So in college, I started a team there with Rob Kearney, who's a very successful strongman. And we started a team called Iron Sports, which Pat coached. And we had strongman, a little bit of powerlifting, some bodybuilding. And, we all trained together in the strength conditioning room there. And, not a lot changed really in terms of like total muscle mass between end of high school and I would say age like 25, 27 maybe, so we're talking like almost 10 years of like, okay, we start lifting seriously at like maybe 12 years old. And then I start college at like 17. So like first 5 years, like exponential progress. That really set the stage with a lot of like early just injuries, just small little soft tissue stuff. Cause I was playing football, playing rugby, lacrosse for a bit, playing a lot of contact sports. So we had that and very heavy lifting and also the propensity early on to be really, really strong. So, went into college with some pretty serious injuries, had some surgeries, recovered from those. And it was kind of like, progress is exponential right up until college. Still made, bits of progress like college through early 20s. But, there was a lot of learning going on in that period, obviously, because I was in college, studying under Pat, doing tons of seminars, continued education. Of course, continued education-wise, it ended up being a lot in the physical therapy realm. So, like, I worked at a physical therapy clinic. I did a bunch of, seminars, whether it was like the FMS, SFMA, the DNS, the, PRI, and shadowed a bunch of coaches and physical therapists and just spent years really trying to like learn how to bulletproof myself, essentially, at least under that notion of like, let me try to, create some kind of solid base to work off of. And I don't know that is really a reality or something that is actually, possible, but that was kind of the premise I had in mind. And, maybe I just wasn't really mentally at the point where I was ready to take that next step and fully like express myself as a bodybuilder. Like Ryan and I have talked in the past about like who we identify with, because, we don't fully identify ourselves with like the traditional bodybuilding and fitness culture, like what you see at, say, like an expo. But we don't fully identify either as like, a full out nerd, who's, whether it be like a researcher or, someone who's just like purely an educator or a seminar buff, so we're kind of like somewhere in the middle. And I think at some point it just clicked like, hey, if we don't identify as a bodybuilder fully, we're never going to be able to commit the time and effort that it's going to take to really reach our goals. And also, we just love this shit. Like, just, just be ourselves, be unique, and kind of like, and people respect that and, give you the space to kind of be you when you do that. So kind of circling back around, graduated college at, upper maybe 220s, right? Maybe peak weight was like getting close to 230 at like 15% body fat or so. And then really the big change was in the last few years. So I just turned 30. I started, let's see. Yeah, I started using like, PEDs at like 27. Yeah. So about three-ish years ago. And that's, where I made a huge leap, from being that like 220s, 230s and, I got up to like 250-ish, let's say like the first year doing that. Like, so basically the idea is like, I want to dip my toe in the water as far as like seeing what I look like on stage after a very short time, like in that realm. So, I started that in 2017. And then within that same year, like in 2018, I did a series of competitions. So, let's say I went from like 220 up to, right around 250. And that was still like not a particularly great or lean 250. It was just kind of like a watery, 15 to 20% body fat. Didn't really have a lot of the knowledge, or proper influence at that time, but just everything in my life kind of came together where it was like, okay, financially, and also just like relationship wise and stability wise in my life, it was the time to really like buckle down and pursue bodybuilding. So, we had mentioned before we got on here, like, did I start off with the goal of saying like, okay, I'm going to be, Mr. Olympia, or I'm going to win this show or that show. And like, it's always just been one step at a time. I always believed if, with enough work and enough time that I could be a pro bodybuilder, because I think that's a goal that as long as you have reasonable genetics, if you put in enough work and enough time, it's possible. You just need to have the right level of knowledge, the right level of effort, and just consistency, over decades. So anyway, in 2018, I entered a few local competitions just to kind of see like what is the overall like shape and just like structure that I'm working with, as kind of like a light heavyweight. So, that's like middle of the road as far as like weight classes go. It's, too light to be a pro bodybuilder, like at my height, so I'm 5'11", and when you look at guys on the like IFBB pro stage at 5'11", and these guys are at least 250 pounds on stage. Maybe they could get away with like 240 if they have just a really, really good structure. So I knew at that point that like, okay, this is not a physique that I'm going to turn pro with, but let's just see what the feedback is. Let's see if it's worth, making the investment that it would take, to even get to that pro level. So in 2018, did my first open show, and by open I mean like not a teenage show. So I had competed previous to that as a teenager, won the Mr. Rochester teen division, and the first show that I did as a light heavyweight, I won the light heavyweight class. Feedback was kind of like, hey, you're not missing anything. You just need to put on more size. And then I did a few shows just in the weeks following that. And like whether I got worse, the other people got better. My placings were worse and worse as the shows went on. So the very last show that I did in 2018, I was actually dead last in my class. I think that was like 5th or 6th. And, I basically set the goal of like, okay, they said, I'm not missing anything. I just need to put on more muscle. Pretty straightforward. What does that look like? As I mentioned, the guys at my height, that are pros, they're right around, 250-ish on stage, right around 300-ish, in the off season. So I said, all right, objectively to meet that standard, now that I've been told like, hey, you have the potential to do this, you just need more horsepower. Like you just need a bigger chassis or a bigger engine, whatever you want to call it. Like that's relatively simple. Like that's something that you can change. It takes a tremendous amount of work. It takes, additional knowledge. It takes resources, but it's achievable. If you say I want to be in the NBA and, you're 5'2", it's just like, yeah, you don't have the cards, right? So like you want to know right off the bat that like you have the potential to do it. So once I knew that, it's just kind of off to the races. So that was 2018. I basically set a 2-year goal of getting to 300 pounds under 15% body fat on a DEXA scan in the off season. I accomplished that even earlier than I expected. So about a year and a half later, I did a DEXA scan. I was 300 at 11.5% body fat, and had some really catastrophic back injuries following that, possibly because of just how rapidly I put on that size, and any number of other factors that we could get into. But so I ended up starting this contest prep at 260 pounds at 20% body fat. So I went from 300 at 11.5%, basically, come off the drugs, work on just recovery, health, went on vacation beforehand. And this is just completely unenhanced, relatively pain-free version in the aftermath. So the dust has settled, and this is kind of what we're left with as a starting place. And, then you have to have that confidence, in the science and in the experience of your coaches that says look, if I was that size before, that muscle memory, those myonuclei, that's there, so that muscle is going to come back as soon as we add back in, the proper environment and stimulus to do so. So we started the diet at 260, fat 260. And then, I ended up competing at, about 245, and for reference, a lot of people say well, what body fat are you at on stage, which nobody knows. And you couldn't even measure even with the best, devices out there, whether it be DEXA, ultrasound, MRI, what have you. But you're talking about something in the low single digits, maybe 3 to 5%. So we actually ended up doing a 30-week contest prep. The original show that I was going to do, we ended up sort of postponing for a number of personal reasons, with my coach. And we picked back up, decided on the Olympia down in Orlando, and we went from a fat 260 to just obviously a contest lean 245 in about 30-week time span. So in total, 23 minutes after asking the question, I did my first competition as a teenager on stage at 180 pounds. And I did my last competition at 245, considerably leaner than I was on stage then. Yeah. Had I dieted down from 300, you just kind of do the math. You say, okay, we'll just call it 10% of that body fat you have to lose. Probably end up somewhere in that 260, 270 range. So the goal right now is to get back up to 300, but to be even leaner and most importantly, healthier than I was. So my goal on paper right now is as it's written, is 300 pounds under 70 millimeters. So we measure skin folds primarily. I do the DEXA scan as more of hey, on paper, I can prove that I was there. When people ask how big were you? When 20 years from now, when I see me on the street and I walk up to me and I say, I used to look like you. And he's like, no, you fucking didn't. Everybody does that. I'll just keep that paper in my back pocket. I'll just keep the DEXA scan. I'll pull it up on my little, virtual, whatever the fuck you're dealing with 20 years from now. And I'll just have that virtual DEXA scan and be like, no, little Ethan, like I really did that, because I can't tell you the number of like homeless people that come up to you on the street. It's like, man, I used to look like you. Pull-ups is what you got to do.
Yeah,
so
park.
so many people. It's like, it makes me think like two things. Like, okay, either these people are really crazy, or I'm really fucked in like 30 years from now. Like, this is where bodybuilding gets you. Like, there were a lot of jack people living underneath that bridge at one point, and over the years, they lost their gym memberships. Yeah, it's a pretty universal thing.
We need to send Ethan to Erlanger, Kentucky, so that he can get like lat posed and flexed on by some like really skinny rednecks with phenomenal mullets. We were in Erlanger, Kentucky
all over the place
for a training camp, and Ryan was getting trolled left and right everywhere we went.
Yeah, I think I'm like the appropriate size to troll. You know, like, I feel like people are pretty comfortable trolling me. Like, I don't know, like, once you get up to Ethan's size, it might just be like, just keep their head down.
Just stay quiet.
Yeah.
Or you're Lexner and you're just 6'5", and you kind of have that Boston, Massachusetts put offish vibe a little bit.
Yeah. I think he probably doesn't get as much of that as I do, but I appreciate it.
Yeah, it was phenomenal.
So that's so like, just kind of as like a recap, like, if like you started lifting probably somewhere around 10 years old. It was just some kind of haze of cement weights and protein shakes at that time, somewhere around 10 years old, and then competed at 180 at the end of high school, right? Like senior. Oh, that was in college, maybe freshman year of college, or
that was actually freshman year of college. Yeah,
freshman year of college. And I know that because I've seen Ethan was also not only an IFBB pro, but he was what would that have been, like the December 2010 teen of the week on bodybuilding.com or something?
That's still what comes up. I mean, I think I can screen share here, right? I think I have that figured out. Let's see.
Yeah, so Ethan was the teen bodybuilder of the week on bodybuilding.com, or the month, maybe, actually. Is this going to pop up on the screen share?
I think so, right?
Oh, that'd be incredible. Well, that's enough of a reason for people to watch.
Yeah, you can screen share on here. Everybody should have.
Can you guys see my screen?
No, we just
not
see
at
you.
the exact moment.
Okay, so I click on screen. I click on, let's see, window maybe. It doesn't. Is there some like permission that you have to give me to do this?
I don't know. We're in uncharted territory right now.
Because you know what, James, can you screen share?
Oh yeah, I've already got it pulled up here.
All right,
Teen Amateur of the Week.
Just Google my name, and that's what that's all. Nothing comes up from the Olympia, but every picture of me is in my boxers, like in the gym I was telling you about that I built.
Yes.
Oh, you're actually on the site.
Bam! There we go.
There it is.
So when people look me up now as like, someone gives them like a referral for this like personal trainer, this is still to this day who they think that I am. This is the number one thing.
This is the number one searchers in Google for Ethan Grossman. That is right. Wonderful.
It is really crazy to see that though, because I mean, like, you were pretty jacked at that age. Like, that's like you're well above the bell curve at that age. But seeing where you're at now is pretty insane. But you obviously had the foundation back then.
Are there any pictures from the Olympia show down in Florida that we could pull up for a frame of reference?
Yeah. If I send them to your email, will that work?
Yeah. If you ping them to my email, I can pull it up.
So right. I think it would be cool, like, on this topic, because Ethan, I would bet a lot of these the things that got you to this level that you got to over this last season, getting up to 300 pounds, coming back down to get into the mid 240s on stage, that didn't all happen over the last 2 years. And specifically what I'm talking about is more like the habits that you built getting into doing all the things you need to do to get into that position, right? So a lot of that stuff, I think, happened around that amateur of the month bodybuilding.com time, right? So what did that look like for you? Like, I mean, we could even take it just like training and then maybe nutrition, or just like an overall psyche, I guess. is we've talked about this a lot, and that you and I both came up reading all of the bodybuilding magazines, subscribed to Muscular Development, reading Flex magazine, watching the videos, the DVDs at that time of these professional bodybuilders, and I think there was this idea that there was no deviation from the plan whatsoever. There is, if you were going to eat 8 times a day, you were going to eat 8 times a day. And if you had to train twice a day, you were going to do that every day. And there was no question to any of this stuff. And I think we both know that that's not really what's required necessarily, but there's something about that psyche that creates success in the long run. And so I don't know how you want to approach that. If you want to just talk about it from like a training perspective, like what's it like when you at that time, like when you're going to train, what did that mean to you? How did you structure your day? And if that's changed at all, and just kind of the overriding theme of just developing this discipline essentially, because that's really what it is, and the ability to plan, which I know that you're among the best of anyone that I've ever seen with that. So if you can kind of speak to that a little bit, that'd be cool.
I got these pictures. I'm going to pull these up super fast.
Yeah.
So the first thing I sent you was the Instagram link to my coaches.
Yep.
Yeah. So that actually gives you a nice kind of like timeline from those early like bodybuilding.com pictures. So you can see things next to each other. And also it just follows basically what I laid out for you with the off season to the injury. So that's, yeah. That, on the left there, that's the bodybuilding.com, 18, 19 years old, I guess, in that picture.
Yep. And then this is down in Florida, about 8 weeks ago? That's
right. And then if you scroll to the right, let's see what the next one is. So yeah, that's just a zoomed in version of the 19-year-old self. Okay. So that's 2018. That's off season.
Yeah. So is this somewhere in that ballpark at like 300 pounds?
That's 300. So yeah, the last one was as a light heavyweight. So I would have been about 198 pounds on stage in the previous one. This is post injury. So the picture you were just on was 300 pounds at like 11%. And then that was, I think the next one, the one we were just looking at where I'm all crooked, that was basically where I was that's how I was walking around on a daily basis, just literally like that side bend. That was me actually showing up to work. So there was a time during that period, where I couldn't walk, I mean, at that point, my wife was trusting me, helping me get through the day just with, little things like getting her shoes on and, literally still training during that period. But after all that, this is kind of where I ended up. The last picture we were looking at 260, 20% body fat. And then this was 30 weeks later. So my coach just wanted to post that up just to show people just kind of like we were talking about before with the whole muscle memory thing and, how you look in the mirror any one day may not be representative of, what your true potential is. And it's nice for people to see just how broad a spectrum it can be from like how a pro bodybuilder may look on stage versus how they may look, in the peak of their off season or at their absolute worst. There's just such a huge difference between them. And it just really paints the picture, I think, of how Ryan and I, to Ryan's point about mindset, kind of look at things where, when I'm taking pictures, for Alex, like I'm not looking at the picture subjectively and analyzing, do I like what I see in the mirror? Like, I don't think the body of a pro bodybuilder, when we were first picking up those, Flex and Muscular Development magazines, I don't think it's like an attractive physique or something to aspire to because I admire it from an artistic standpoint. I think there are lots of people out there that do that. And there's something wrong with that. But because Ryan and I grew up in an era where Ronnie Coleman was Mr. Olympia and then Jay Cutler was Mr. Olympia.
Yeah, we got these other ones that you shared also I can pull up.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you don't look at those physiques and think like, how I want to look because it's pretty.
Mm-hmm.
What happens is you kind of just, you see the process of like what they went through to get there. And it's almost cool because I think if you started lifting in maybe the 70s and 80s, you looked at physiques that were really pretty and they were something that you could aspire to just from an artistic or, even the standpoint of like, just wanted to pick up chicks or whatever. Like there was that idea of like the skinny weakling, and this is what you want to look like because there's some value just in that as an image.
Mm-hmm.
And at least for myself, like it was never about creating an actual physique or, a particular look. I'm going to look however I'm going to look with added muscle. Like I don't particularly control that. The guys who have very quote unquote like aesthetic and pretty physiques, that's just how they're going to look. Like a guy like Frank Zane, who is like known as, one of the most like quote unquote aesthetic physiques of all time. If he could have been more muscular, he would have been. I mean, his nickname was the Chemist, which literally tells you a little bit about like, how hard he pushed that side of things to try to get bigger. What happens a lot of times in retrospect is people act like what they did to get there produced that result. It's like, oh, my calves got this big because I did, X, Y, and Z as a kid. And they really just pay they give very little like attention to the other things, whether it be genetics or early environment. They had no control over that, put them there. And I think when you look at it objectively, it's like there are things that are in your own hands to change. And there are things like we talked about earlier that are just fixed. So your shape for the most part is going to be your shape. And you're not truly sculpting that. You're mostly just, adding clay on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
So, it was more of a process of like, you don't know what the end result's going to look like. You don't know if it's going to be really pretty and, aesthetic and shapely, or if you're just going to be a big, refrigerator. Like, but you just, you put one foot in front of the other and you take 5 steps and you look in the mirror, you take a picture, you step on stage, you see how it looks, you take another 5 steps. And for some people, they just keep stepping until they're Mr. Olympia. And for other people, they step, until they're, last place and, the natural Mr., Idaho Classic or whatever. But either way, it's the same journey, and I think along the way, you just use the tools and resources that solve the problem ahead of you. And it's no different for like any endeavor in life. If you have a business, it's the same way. You start off with something that you believe is going to make a positive impact, on yourself or others around you, and you solve a problem. And then eventually you're presented with another problem and you solve that. And, you have some sort of vague idea of the direction you want to move in. And you're always sort of orienting yourself in that direction, but you don't know along the way what problems are going to come up and you're going to have to solve, or, ultimately what potential you have, or even what you're going to want when you get to that place. You may find 10 years down the line that what you wanted as a teenager is not the same thing that you wanted as an adult. So it's simply just like, I think people look at, Ryan and I and think like we had this very clear vision of exactly what we were going to be, 20 years down the line, when in the reality is we just kind of, we saw other people doing that process. We enjoyed it. We oriented ourselves in a particular direction, and then we just problem solved along the way. And where we are now is just kind of amalgam of all those, individual steps and individual problems that we solved, to find ourselves here.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot. I mean, I think from a logistics standpoint, like as you mentioned, that's the approach to anything that you're going to do in life. if you want to be successful at that thing, right? Like you just continuously solve what's the next problem, what's the next domino that I need to knock over. And your capacity to be focused on those things is what's, I think, really holding back and hurting and limiting people, because they don't do a good job of actually shaving down on what that thing is. They're trying to do 17 things at once. Like you can't solve 17 problems at once, right? You got to figure out like what is the one problem that needs to get solved. Like the biggest thing that's going to give me an actual ROI on the investment I'm going to be putting in here.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think it's so huge. Like, I think like you, even just from the beginning of your story, like the first thing, like your first experience with weightlifting was shit that you bought yourself. Like, how did you buy that stuff? You got a fucking job, you know, at 10 years old. You know what I mean? Like, so I feel like you're able to do that it's so automatic that it's like, okay, well, I want to start lifting. I don't have any weights. Like, I honestly, I think that it sounds really intuitive to us maybe, but there's a lot of people that get hung up on that shit where it's just like, oh, I can't do it. I don't live by a gym. It's like, okay, like I have no way of getting to the gym. I don't have a car. I'm too young. Like, I mean, I remember riding my bike in the winter to the gym. It was like, I got a bicycle. Like, it's not going to be all that comfortable. Like you got to work out in a basement. You got to have a fucking heater. You know. So I think just things like that, learning how to just identify problems you become really, really good at. And that's the first thing of just understanding that these like things are going to pop up. It's never going to be a smooth trip. Like, I don't think your last prep could have been any crazier really in a lot of ways, but you stayed so even throughout. And so I'm curious if there's like, how did you develop that? Is that something that you think that was innate to you as a individual, or is that something that you had to develop consciously?
No, I don't think it was developed consciously. I think it was, you know, the environment that I was put in, you know, for better or for worse at times, that, you know, I work, like I said, in Manhattan, and a lot of my clients are really successful, you know, from a wealth standpoint. And I really enjoy talking to them about their journeys as well. And, you know, what they think were the factors that influence them. What are the behaviors and habits that they have? And one of the big things that you actually find is, you know, ultimately what makes, you know, most of us successful is that it's sort of this like greatest strength is our greatest weakness kind of situation, where there's some type of like compensation that you're making early on. There's some discomfort. Like ultimately, like we said, it starts with steps, and steps are movement. And it's like, how do you create movement? Well, you have to have some degree of, you know, you have to have some degree of asymmetry. You have to have some degree of discomfort. You have to have an impetus to move. So how do you create that impetus to move? And most people aren't, you know, we're not going to purposely make ourselves uncomfortable typically until you learn later on in life that doing that can actually be advantageous. But early on, a lot of people are faced, I think, with uncomfortable situations, and they're forced to create strategies to cope with that. And, you know, like I was talking to one of my clients the other day, who is the founder of, you know, one of the biggest companies, you know, in the US. And, he's gay, and, he was telling me about, how he was just on vacation, on an island over Thanksgiving, and 40 of his, gay friends were also there. This is an island that basically only people with like $100 million and up, you know, vacation on. And 40 of his closest friends were all there. You know, he didn't invite them. He didn't fly them out there. They just all happened to be hanging out there, and they had dinner together on Thanksgiving. So all 40 of these guys were not with their families on Thanksgiving. They're all worth, you know, tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars. And they're all in this one place. And, you know, I said to him, like, well, why do you think, you know, if you live in Manhattan long enough, you realize like the city is mostly run by gay guys and Jewish guys. And it's actually a really small population overall. And, you know, if you read like the book Outliers, it tells you a little bit about how the Jewish population got there. But you don't hear as much about the gay population. I would say like probably a large majority of my male clients are actually gay as well. And, you know, I said to him, well, why do you think there are just so many successful gay people in Manhattan? And immediately when you ask people in his position, because I've asked the similar question to several of my clients, they're just like, oh, compensation, like 100%. Like, we just dealt with a lot of discomfort, a lot of trials, you know, as children, and we had to create strategies to deal with that discomfort and to compensate for it. And a lot of these guys compensated like with achievement. So I think, you know, for better or for worse, you know, because there are times, and though a lot of these guys will also tell you, yeah, you know, a lot of us have achieved great things, but we still don't necessarily have that level of like contentment. And it shows in their relationships. It shows in their ability to just sort of self-regulate and just deal with change, deal with stress, deal with uncertainty. You know, you see that crop up a lot. And, you know, in our clients who, you know, are very wealthy and successful in one hand, when they're faced with uncertainty from a different stressor, you know, you can very quickly see that child come out. You can very easily see that expression of fear, the inability to self-regulate, and all of those sort of like primal stress patterns reveal themselves. So my point is that very early on, I think, you know, we're exposed to a set of stressors, and the strategies that we pick to deal with that stressor ultimately shapes what we choose to do as a career. And, you know, that can be a very selfish thing. I think, like, you know, no one would argue that bodybuilding has a large component of selfishness to it, or it could be a very selfless thing. You know, my wife works with sick kids in the hospital and brings like summer camp programming to them. You know, so the both sides of the spectrum, but, you know, knowing her and knowing her friends and knowing people like Ryan and myself, we're all just trying to use strategies that we learned very early on to help self-regulate our biology. And, you know, for myself, that may be through organization, through planning, through controlling my environment. And all of those strategies are very positive as a bodybuilder. On the flip side, that can't be your only strategy, because as soon as you step outside of that realm and you're faced with novel stressors where that strategy is no longer, you know, optimal or no longer conducive, and it can actually lead, you know, to sort of compensatory patterns of behavior, you know, then you have to expand yourself again, you know. So that's kind of like the stage I'm at now, is just realizing like, okay, the things that Ryan's talking about that are so positive in getting me to where I am today, I have those, I'll always have them, and I resort to them under stress. Now the trick is like, how can you use those strategies when they're useful, and then also have the degree of variability and the ability to swing not just back and forth between high and low, but find a middle ground where you can just be human for a bit and regulate yourself without these really high threshold strategies, just in normal day-to-day life. And I think, like I said early on, you know, for me, bodybuilding was a tool or an avenue, you know, to really make myself a better person. And, you know, I try to share that, you know, with the people around me and with, you know, people that ask me about, you know, becoming a bodybuilder or this path. You know, I try to express that to them because I think it's been a very positive influence on my life. But if you just simply use it as a means to a better physique, you can really miss out. You know, when you look at a lot of these, you know, these great bodybuilders over the years, most of the Mr. Olympias have gone on to be very successful in business and other ventures afterwards. And I think not only can you use it to be more successful at a very, you know, we'll say sympathetic sort of endeavor, like running a business, which is very akin to bodybuilding. But for me, the path now is like, how can I also learn better self-regulation and a better ability to communicate with others and to share and, to be kind and give back to others? And how do you sort of like use bodybuilding as, we'll say, almost like an excuse to get better at that stuff too? Because you come to a point where you're like, okay, I know how to turn on, I know how to dial in, I know how to get that tunnel vision and to execute tasks when things are laid out in a very like linear and structured format. But then how do you shut that off, relax, and, spend time, with loved ones and friends, and put yourself in a mental and emotional state that's conducive to recovery? So you can kind of give the excuse of like, I'm trying to be a nicer, better person so that I can recover better for bodybuilding. When it's like a lie. It's like you just want to be a better person because you want to live a better life. Like the end goal is you just want to live a happy life, and that's like what all of us are trying to get to. But if sometimes if you just frame it as like, hey, the goal is to be, Mr. Olympia or what have you, and you say, okay, the thing that's holding you back from this right now is you need to be able to switch states. You can't be on all the time. And not only does being in that sympathetic state and that very structured environment end up being not conducive to things outside of the sport at times, but also what happens is you end up wasting a lot of time if you stay in that state all the time, because a lot of things aren't important. You can only, like to your point, James, like you can only focus on so many things at a given time. And what I find even with my very successful clients is they end up wasting so much time trying to structure things and organize things in a way that makes them feel safe, but is not necessarily conducive to moving the ball down the court, especially when it comes to things that are outside of exactly the specific realm that they've trained themselves to do. So I think it's very important to sort of weed out the unproductive behaviors in your life. And if you have, a really specific goal, the only way you're going to, one, survive emotionally, like psychologically long enough to get there is, by inhibiting, some of these stress responses and some of these, self-regulating behaviors and find better strategies. And also, the only way you're going to get there from a productivity standpoint, if you're trying to do multiple things at once, is to weed out unproductive behaviors and to have enough interoception and enough ability to just analyze your behaviors to say like, okay, I know in the moment it feels like this is what I need to do, but is it actually moving me forward? And that's something nowadays that, definitely occupies my mind a lot of the time is, I can work hard, but like what to work hard at any given moment, can be difficult to decide and also to inhibit. We have so many options. And I think that's like a big problem in this day and age is we're just faced with like all these different inputs all the time, and deciding which inputs to let into your life is literally who you are. You can select what you do with your time, and you don't have that much control over anything else other than that. Simply, you are what you do with your time. You are your thoughts, and the behavior that you express and manifest via those thoughts is who you are. So choosing what to do with your time is one of the most important things that you can do. And because there's so many damn options in this day and age, I think it's one of the, paramount questions that we face like in every moment.
Ryan, do you want to take a stab and piggyback on that? That was gold. I thought that was fantastic.
Yeah, man. I think it's just one of the things that I've recognized in Ethan is just how good he is at eliminating distractions. And that's something that he's helped me a lot with indirectly. Not something we've really talked about all that much, but just watching him, and you as well, James, you're the same way. Just very unemotional about just figuring out what needs to be done and not getting distracted by other bullshit. And that's really challenging, man. Like that's, I think that's something that people don't even realize how bad they are at for the most part. I'm at like the conscious incompetence phase of that right now. It's just like, yeah, that's something I do have trouble with. I'm getting much better with. But watching, guys like you guys take that on is really cool. Yeah.
You have a lot of thoughts in this realm. I spent a lot of time thinking about
I'm sure, yeah.
like what Ethan is talking about, because I think it is so massively important for your capacity to do fucking anything in life well. Like I had this long thought yesterday. I was on we have like a bunch of trails right over by the house. I went on like an hour-long ruck yesterday, and I thought a lot about the concept of just normalcy. And I'm like, the last thing in life I want to be considered is fucking normal. I do not want to be normal. I hate the concept of being normal. And I think that then, spoke wheels out into everything that Ethan's talking about. Your capacity to remove things from your life that are not actually moving you forward, right? That like via negativa concept that, blanking on his name right now, the guy that wrote Anti-Fragile and Randomness, Nassim Taleb talks about that a lot in his writings. I think it's incredibly important. You need to be ruthless, and you need to cut a lot of things out of your life, because the downside to how things are structured nowadays is everybody else wants to tell you what should be important for you, right? Like that's what texting is. That's what email is. That's what social media is everybody else trying to essentially influence and set your agenda for you, which is bullshit. Like it is very hard to get in touch with me intentionally. Like my phone lives on do not disturb. I don't hardly ever check my email. It gets funneled through a particular process. Like I feel like everybody is trying to do more, and I am perpetually in the process of trying to do less and less. I am trying to simplify everything down as much as I can so I can devote as much time, effort, and energy into a few things that actually really matter, like for me and for my family, right? But I think that people struggle with that a lot, right? And that's where it takes time, it takes practice, it takes a lot of reflection. Like you have to build time in to plan and think about things. So the point you made, Ethan, I think is so important. And nowadays people lose this is they just start working on shit. They just work. It's just work. It's like, I don't work on anything until I have spent a lot of time determining that that's the direction I want to go in. I probably spend more time planning than I actually. The execution's easy once I've made up my mind on this is the direction we need to go in. The issue is people don't do that. They just start doing all these different things, and it's just the shotgun blast of hard work. And yeah, there's some semblance of luck to be involved with that. If I just work hard on a lot of things, like who knows if I stir the pot up, what's going to come out, right? But you need to be very intentional. Like I have no interest in working hard on anything until I've taken the time to determine that that thing is worth working hard on, right? And I think that like this conversation is like mandatory across the board in everything you're going to do in your relationships in life, in your profession, in your business, in training, right? And I think if you suck at doing this, which most humans do, this is the value of having a coach, if not a coach, at least an outside unbiased third-party observer who can be a sounding board in this realm for you. It can be a good friend. It can be a training partner. It can be a business partner, whatever it is. That's a lot of times the value in those relationships is because they can look at it from that unbiased perspective that you can't have. Like I think that's where a coach is so important to me. Like if you truly care about an outcome in something in life, I think it's worth having a coach in that realm just because they're the ones that are going to really help trim the fat down and get you to focus on the things that matter. Because when left on our own, we're going to shiny object syndrome ourselves to death probably. And it's like, yeah, I don't know. I think this is a realm that people need to spend way more time in.
I'm sure
like
people
reading
tune in. I'm sure people tune in to this, podcast if like the title says anything about, bodybuilding or muscle building, and they just like want to fast forward until they get to the part about training and program design, nutrition, what have you. And it's funny because like I don't do a lot of podcasts purposely for the reasons we were just talking about. Mm-hmm. But when I do, I would say 90% of it just ends up kind of being in this realm. And the reality is that's actually what's important. Like, I know people kind of want to skip over that, but the reason why it's what I talk about most of the time is because it's actually what I think about most of the time. And, you know, to be fair, it's what I think about now. And if you interviewed, you know, a version of me 10 years ago, it would be similar, but not exactly the same. So I'm reflecting from a certain vantage point, and that has its advantages and disadvantages as well, because you don't want to know, you know, what an athlete's training program is necessarily when they're in the NBA. You know, you might have wanted to know what that was, you know, in high school, or how they got there, right? So in some ways I am trying to reflect and give you a perspective from where I was, but I can only look at the vantage point that I have now. But yeah, I think a couple things there, and then, you know, we can definitely move away from this if you want to just get into some just like straightforward, quick, you know, rapid fire Q&A stuff on training and whatnot. But also the ability, I think for me now, like having developed that ability to plan, and, you know, also really an intrinsic desire, and almost like there's a certain pain point associated with not doing that because I've been rewarded for that behavior. I think now the trick is actually inhibiting the need to do that at times, because it's not always productive. Like, yes, planning is a strategy, and reflecting is a strategy, and being able to sort of organize things in a way where you feel in control is a strategy. And you know, a lot of people, you know, that have been successful at anything say what you said, James, about not wanting to be normal, which is clearly pathological. Like, you know, it's definitely not. And I don't mean that in a bad way. Like, it's in a good way. But I mean, pathological just means different than the norm. So by definition, it is pathological. So something had to happen to create that desire, and it brings a lot of good things to our lives. But everything that's good, you know, much like if you follow the comics, like everything that's good has a downside.
Oh yeah.
And you know, you'll notice when I talk, I just go on sort of like tangents that last, you know, like 15 minutes, because I'll think of something else as I'm talking, but I promise I'll circle back. Like in your intake form for the podcast, you had one of these like standard grand finale questions of like, if you could have any superpower, what would it be? And like whenever I listen to podcasts, like they always finish with like, okay, now the final question is like, if you could be a shoe, what shoe, you know, like that kind of stuff. And I always like, fuck, if I have to answer this stuff live, like I'm just going to totally draw a blank, because, you know, I am a planner, and I am someone who likes to really think about that answer and give you something that's just not generic, off the cuff, and, you know, the first thing that comes to mind. So I was actually walking the dog when I was filling out that form with my wife, and I did probably take about 10 minutes just to kind of go through the thought process, and sort of like, it's like when I'm ordering food at a restaurant, I just start, but not with what I want, but just by crossing out things that I definitely don't want. So I started thinking about like the different superheroes and different potential superpowers. And I kind of start with the notion of like, okay, you probably either want to like help as many people as possible, you know, with this superpower, or, you know, have it be something that allowed you to live the happiest, you know, possible life that you could, right? Like I said, that's kind of like the end goal for all of us. And that either comes through our own personal, like, combination between, you know, achievement and fulfillment. And part of that is just, you know, being able to help other people. That's kind of the end point. So I thought, okay, maybe you'd have this superpower where you could like heal other people. But that's super problematic, because if you're not also like have superhuman strength, or some type of like ability to defend yourself, like you're just going to be detained and basically used for your powers. Like, you're not going to be able to help anyone. Your life's going to suck. Like, you're just going to be in a cell, and rich people are just going to basically rape you. So that was out, and then I'm
gonna
like,
pause
well, really...
just for 1 second here, because I love how much thought went into this. Because I've never asked that question live. It's more there. Like, I'll pull it up. I'm like, man, we're struggling. Like, let's see if we can use this as a conversation starter. But I love the amount of thought that went into this, because most people are just like flight or strength. It's just like
expectation.
It's like I want to fly or I want to be strong. It's one of the two usually, like immediately. But I love the thought process here. It's great.
Well, that's the problem. That's just my whole point. It's good and it's bad, right? Like, is it really productive? But it actually, like, this thought process, I think was really useful. And I asked the question to like several clients and tried to get people's, perspective. And I feel pretty confident in like the answer that I settled on it. But I would love to hear a better one. I'm sure there is a better one out there. But did we end up re-recording again?
Huh? Oh yeah, we've been recording the whole time.
Oh, okay. All right.
My bad.
So I went, and then I'm like, all right, well, maybe it's like the ability to influence people, because, a big part of what makes us happy is our relationships, and part of achievement, the primary part of achievement really, as human beings, is your influence on other people, your ability to communicate. But the problem with that is you also don't want to be liked by everyone. You don't want to be correct every time. Like, that's not a positive environment to be in. Like, you want to be able to struggle. You want to be wrong. You want people to be honest with you. So that's problematic as well. And when I think about setting goals, and I think about sort of like the primary components that, sort of make up a person's life. And, to your point about asking this question as kind of just like a space filler, if, the conversation loses momentum. If I'm with a client, I have I think 5 things that I sort of cycle through in my head with a new client. If we just, don't have much to talk about, don't have, common ground on anything, or when I get done with sessions, I always record these things. If I run through them real quickly, either during the session or afterwards, and I just say in my head, has anyone told me today about any of these 5 areas? And they're in order of what I think is important as far as just your overall quality of life. And the first one is your health. I think that really is the foundation of your quality of life. Just meaning number one, if you're dead, you are by definition not living, therefore you cannot live your best life. And also, your ability again to self-regulate, to deal with the environment, to interact with other people, form good relationships. A lot of that is, due to your internal chemistry, your ability to deal with the stressors, both conscious and unconscious, in your environment and in communicating and forming relationships with others. So I believe health, and that's a very broad category of what falls under that. That's number one. Number 2 is your relationships. Number 3 is your hobby, your passion. Number 4 is your job, which hopefully is also your hobby and your passion. And then lastly, your environment, where do you live? Do you like being near the ocean? Do you like being in the woods? Where do you train? Do you have the right equipment? So I also put that last in my hierarchy of training of mindset, training, nutrition, recovery, chemistry, and environment being that last thing of a lot of people say, well, if I just had this equipment, if I just trained at this gym, or if I just lived in this place, or if I was just around these people, that's all your environment. That's the least important thing about who you are. So, after a session, somebody might say my digestion I'm not sleeping as well as I have been because of my newborn. Okay. That's under the category of health. They might say I'm going on a trip, to Vegas next week. That's their environment. So you can pretty much always, fit something like the topics that people talk about into one of those 5 things when they're talking about themselves. But the important thing is that they go in a hierarchy. So for me, that health is first on the hierarchy. So in terms of superpowers, it kind of comes back to that, because I feel like Wolverine kind of has the best superpower, which is that he has superhuman healing. I don't think you want to live forever, and it's kind of debatable whether Wolverine does or does not live forever. But I think the ability to have, sort of perfect health until you die would probably be the best case scenario. Mm-hmm. Because even if you could fly, you would die on your first flight. Like as soon as like a bird hits you, like there's no way you're going to survive that. So that's just stupid. I don't know. Even if you could travel through space and time, like you'd probably die going through a black hole. Like, so that's also people want to transport. I don't know. All of these superpowers, like even if you had superhuman strength, like, I mean, I can, attest that I was pretty strong and it just got me more hurt. Like the more, training to be, so imagine you could lift a car, like imagine what would happen to your joints, if you actually did have that level of strength. So like literally every single one of these superpowers for the most part, you couldn't even handle without the health to do it. Mm-hmm. And I just think, living to old age and just always being able to keep, that level of youthfulness, and being able to pursue anything you wanted to without any limiters. And if you wanted to fly, you could jump out of a plane or get shot by a cannon. Like you could literally like do anything without consequence. I think you still want pain. You still want to feel pain. But at the end of the day, there's no real consequence to it. So, you're virtually invincible. So yeah, that's what I went with is with superhuman healing. You would also obviously be Mr. Olympia because you could just train your ass off. So it's kind of like, the point is it's more about limiting downside than it is about creating upside. And I think that's really important. Like when it comes to, say bodybuilding, where anyone's at, but especially where Ryan and I are at right now, it's mostly about limiting downside. So like I said, my primary goal right now is yes, to get to 300 under 70 millimeters, but I never quite finished the rest of that goal, which was with no orthopedic discomfort and no sleep apnea. So in quotations underneath that, I say, at 300 pounds, I want to be able to sit on the toilet and not be able to pinch a roll of fat. Anyone who's ever dieted for a show, who's ever dieted down really far, knows that when you sit down on the toilet, like you can pretty much always grab fat on your stomach until you're like right near the end of, contest prep. You got to be very, very lean to sit down and only grab like foreskin on your stomach. That's a different level. So, I want to be able to sit down and not grab, a chunk of fat. Like usually my goals are, there's always some level of like clear objectivity. Like there's a millimeter marker there, that's a level of fatness. But where I'm at right now, it's really about decreasing the downside. Like I said, it's really about health. And I know I can put on muscle at this point. The problem actually is putting it on too fast most of the time, like getting too heavy, whether that be fat, muscle, whatever. There's just, the downside takes so much more off than the upside adds on. So if I get too heavy too fast, there's issues orthopedically, there's issues with sleep, there's issues, with health as far as, blood chemistry, as far as, things like insulin sensitivity go. Like there's just so much more downside to pushing, on the edge of the cliff than there is upside to being at that level. So when you are someone who sort of naturally is uncomfortable with being normal, like you say, mostly what you're doing is protecting against downside. So mostly what you need a coach for, to your point, is to limit your downside. So a lot of times clients will ask me about buying a particular device or doing a particular, type of diet or supplement or whatever. And what they're actually saying is, I'm going to do this anyway. Just give me permission to do it, right? Like they're not really asking me. So they get upset when I tell them, no, that's stupid. Like I've been doing this, for 20 years. And of course, like that's not, depending on what, state I'm in, again, health first. Like if I'm, 3 weeks out for a contest, it may just be as blunt as that. No, that's stupid. Don't bother with that. But in the right, state, in the right frame of mind, there's a little bit more listening and a little bit more back and forth that goes on. But the moral is that, they want to add behaviors on, even if those behaviors aren't necessarily the core principles that are going to move them forward. It's, they're distractions, right? One of my favorite things that can happen with a coach, and, I have a list of people that I basically consult with in various areas, and then sort of like one head coach at this time that oversees everything, a guy named Alex Keekle. When I feel like if there's something that I can do to get better, I am doing a disservice if I don't at least investigate that thing. And that's problematic because, like we said, you only have so much time, and you really need to focus your energy on the rocks, the big rocks that are going to provide the most bang for their buck. And really, the people that are successful in any endeavor are mostly just focusing on those things, like literally just the simplest foundational rocks. And they're just going back to the drawing board and just day in and day out getting better at those things. So all the little pebbles, all the shingles on the roof, whatever you want to call it, sprinkles on the cake, like all those things really aren't what makes, the people at the top successful. So it's being able to sort out what are and what aren't big rocks. Mm-hmm. And that's like really where a coach comes into play, whether through knowledge or through experience. So when my coach says to me, no, Ethan, don't do that. And I say, hey, Alex, what do you think about this? And he says like, that's not a good use of your time. It makes me really happy because I don't even have the time to do it. I just feel like I can't not pursue it. It's a pain point to me. It's like, it makes me uncomfortable to not at least pursue something that could be advantageous, even though, it may not be the thing that I need to focus on at this time. So having a coach tell me, hey, don't waste your time on this. It's something that I've studied or pursued previously, and it's not, what you need to focus on right now. That's a very relieving thing because like, I really don't want to spread myself more thin. I really don't know where I'd fit that into my day, but you sort of have permission to not do something. I think when you've, sort of trained yourself and you've been rewarded for doing more, that's a really big relief. And that's a really important thing to have in your life is people who tell you what not to do.
Yeah, 1000% in agreement. I mean, like the biggest value, the reason you pay money to have a coach is for that reason right there. It's like you're paying for the knowledge and the know-how and their ability to say, here's what we're focusing on. And just to continually make sure that we're focused on the things that actually matter right now. Like all the people that we get at Rebel, they tend to always want lots of different outcomes. And I think that part of the reasons that we are successful as a coaching staff at Rebel is because we are perpetually just like, we hack shit left and right. That's a lot of what we're doing is just keeping people from doing dumb things. It's like, no, we're not going to do this. That's stupid. Throw it out. Like we're just like, we're throwing out stuff left and right. And we actually just get them into a simple system where we're devoting the vast majority of our effort and energy into things that actually matter. And when we do that, you're like, oh, wow, like look how much progress I've made in 12, 16 weeks. So it's like, yeah, because we stopped doing all this other stupid stuff. Right. And I think that's part of the problem. Like I love the rock, pebble, sand analogy. I think when people are generally left on their own, like if you have a jar, right? If you just take a mason jar and I want to fill this thing up, a lot of people put sand and pebbles in first and there's no room to fit rocks in, right? It's like you got to put the few big rocks you can into there and then put in pebbles and then the sand goes in last. But most people are going to go in the opposite direction because they're just over inundated with all the different things they could be doing nowadays. Right? It's like, no, I think that is fantastic. Ryan, do you have anything else? We'll probably wrap this here pretty soon. I mean, we're already at an hour and 20 minutes. We don't really even need to talk like nuts and bolts training stuff. Like I think that this has been fantastic.
Yeah, I think that most people have the nuts and bolts really, like they're not all that fancy. And I think what like you need to understand a lot of times is when you're getting all this information, like people are trying to sell you something, right?
Yeah.
So the big rocks have already been sold. Like we know what a lot of those things are. So you're going to get a lot of the little stuff that might matter at some level, maybe at some point. But until you've actually figured out what those big rocks are, it's going to be kind of useless. So I think like if anyone would take any kind of action steps out of this, out of listening to this, it's figure out what those things are and then just chop other shit out. Get rid of the noise, man. And, figure out where your distractions are. Like if it's, I don't know, for example, like I check my Instagram twice a week. Like there is literally no reason for me to be on there more than twice a week. Like I check my DMs. Is anybody interested in anything? Okay, great. It takes me 10 minutes total out of my week. Like there's nothing else for me to be gained otherwise. Right. So figure out what those things are, where your distractions may lie, and just focus on eliminating things and then building the important things.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's going to be true in any endeavor, right? Like when we're writing training programs, a lot of it is figuring out where do we actually need to be focusing our time, effort, and energy. Because I don't know about you, dude, but like when I get people on board and I'm looking at what they've been doing, I'm like, sweet mother of God, like look at all of this stuff. I'm like, no wonder you're not getting better. Like you're doing everything all the time, every day. It's like if we just cut all this stuff down and make this simpler for you, like we're gonna be right back on path. Like this is exactly where we want to be. We're gonna start making progress again. But again, that's a lot easier said than done for a lot of people, because when you're trying to do it to yourself and you're in it, you kind of have those blinders on with your own ego.
Totally. Yep.
Right? Yeah. No, I love this. This has been a fantastic conversation. Ethan, my man, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, James.
Yeah, man. Thanks, Ethan. Appreciate it.
All right, family. I hope you guys enjoyed this. This may not have been exactly what was planned, but I think it's probably not probably. It is what this is what you really need to hear. These are the things that you really need to be working on. Like these are the principles and the heuristics that are going to allow you to be successful. Less so like what exact set and rep scheme should I use, which does matter, but probably to a lesser extent, as long as we're in the realm of doing something that's pretty reasonable. And like, I think most people know it's pretty reasonable in that realm, hopefully by now, because it's like, we're not rocket scientists. What we do really is not like that crazy complicated or difficult. Anyways, have a fantastic week, friends. And we'll talk to you guys soon.
Thanks, guys.